Welcome, everybody, to another hyper, super, mega special episode of The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming to you on Tuesday at 2, which is Pub Day, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and all the places. I have a super special guest for you today, somebody whose meteoric rise is only just beginning. But first, a few words about Mighty Blaze for those who may have been living under a rock and not know. A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. We started at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody's book tours were canceled, and since we have grown into the juggernaut you know so well and love so well today. At A Mighty Blaze, we are not ever asking for your money. We do it because we love books. Love is the currency on A Mighty Blaze, and likes. So if you want to like us on Facebook, Insta, LinkedIn, whatever you use, just give us a like, give us a follow. That's how you can support A Mighty Blaze. But if you are in the mood to spend money, I have an idea. Spend it on startling, bracing debuts about hung-up, quirky people in a dying Rust Belt town. Books that garner comps to David Foster Wallace, Jennifer Egan, Dennis Johnson. Books about medieval saints and late-stage capitalism. Books about misfits trapped in decaying affordable housing. Books that are so breathtaking in ambition and virtuosically inventive that you just have to stop, sit down, and catch your breath. Books, ladies and gentlemen, like The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. Open a few browser tabs, order a few copies. We will wait. We will also put a link on how to buy The Rabbit Hutch via your local independent bookstore through bookshop.org in the chat. Buy it from there. That's even better. If you have a question for the great Tess, please put it in the chat. It will make its way to us, and we will ask her at the end of the show. But now, an introduction. Tess Gunty has an MFA in creative writing from NYU, where she was a Lillian Vernon Fellow. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Iowa Review, Granta, LitHub, Joyland, Freeman's, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. In August, booksellers across the UK awarded The Rabbit Hutch the Waterstone Debut Fiction Prize, voting it the best debut novel of 2022, which I thought was sort of funny because like 2022 was like still like 4 months from being over, but they were just like, it's over. I mean, we've seen enough. We have seen enough. This is the best debut book of the year. The Rabbit Hutch was also a Barnes & Noble Discover Pick of the Month and an Indie Next Pick. And just last month, drum roll, The Rabbit Hutch was longlisted for the National Book Award. My goodness. Amid this fanfare and hype, the great Tess Gunty has decided to join us today. Tess, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Of course. I am nothing if not generous. Now, Tess, one of the reasons why I love having this show is because there's a feeling I get sometimes at the end of books, like I just want to sit down next to the author and just be like, what was that about? I mean, this book was very, okay, let me say this. I was going to say this book is unlike any book I've read in a really long time. That's how it felt. And then all of a sudden, I think that Jennifer Egan comp really works. I mean, the book is so different in so many ways, which is why it didn't occur to me at first. But then when I heard people talk about the Goon Squad, and I know you've brought that up too, I was like, oh, I see. And it is sort of similar to that. But anyway, people are just coming up with so many incredible comps, and it must feel great to kind of have your work received this way.
It really does. I think I'm a writer who is really fueled by reading. I have to read a lot more than I write every day. And when I started this book, I was inspired by a lot of polyphonic fiction I was reading, including Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, but so many other books. And so to be in the same sentence as any of those people is incredible.
It's amazing. And I think what's kind of cool, we'll talk more about the comps later because I have some thoughts, and I have an interesting comp that I think nobody else has brought up yet, and I can't wait to spring it upon you. But the comps, I feel like, are sort of people sort of feeling like me, just sort of like, what even is this? There's so much happening here. It's so cool. It's so fresh. It's so different. And I think people are almost trying to ground themselves in like, what is this new fresh voice we're seeing? So to me, it's like, it's just so interesting. I don't feel like people grasp for comps that much the way they do with this book, which I think speaks to the freshness of the work.
Well, thanks for saying that. Yeah, I mean, I think I almost didn't submit this book precisely because I didn't know who to compare it to. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, we'll get into your publication journey and all that stuff in a minute. But just first, why don't we just lay the groundwork here? Tell us, kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of the Rabbit Hutch.
So the Rabbit Hutch takes place in a fictional post-industrial town called Vacaville, Indiana, and the town is dying. It's on the eve of this revitalization plan. And the book follows a group of characters over the course of 3 days one summer as their lives kind of violently collide.
Mm-hmm. And the setting of the work is really important, I think. Can you give us just a picture of the setting of this town, Vacaville?
Yeah, so Vacaville was somewhat inspired by my hometown, which is South Bend, Indiana. That used to be home to Studebaker Automobiles. It was at one point the largest car manufacturing facility in America, but it closed pretty abruptly in the 60s. And in South Bend, we had the University of Notre Dame there to absorb some of the economic shock when Studebaker closed. But in a number of other cities in the Rust Belt, like Flint, Michigan, and Gary, Indiana, Youngstown, Ohio, there weren't other major industries there or economies there to sort of take the fall. And so I was really struck by this kind of purgatorial sensation that I felt in my town growing up, and immediately recognized in other similar towns whenever I would, like as soon as I would step into them. And I think when I was starting to write the book, that purgatorial sensation was the thing that I wanted to capture. And then most of my characters live in this affordable housing complex called the Rabbit Hutch. It's this old converted building that used to house factory workers for the car company that was in this fictional town, which in this book is called Zorn. And it's a really rundown building, and the lives are, you can kind of hear everyone's lives playing out because the walls are very thin. And that was the sort of structure for the book.
Yeah, I've heard you speak in other interviews just so eloquently about, the extraction economy and like this feeling of decay and like the way that, in the coastal parts of this country, the kind of craters of the extraction economy are invisible or so far away as to be irrelevant, and not in the middle of Indiana. And I've heard you also say just kind of how you feel like these kinds of places are really overlooked in American literature. And one of the dynamics I loved most is just your absolutely like vibrant, virtuosic writing and language, coupled with this kind of like economically bombed out zone.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really read anything that took place in the Rust Belt growing up. I know that books must exist, and I know there are other authors from Indiana, but this region of the country is home to millions of people. And I think the message that you receive when you don't read any stories that take place in a town like yours is that your lives are not worthy of narratives. And they're not worthy of attention of other people. And so I wanted to write against that force.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the journey for this book. So you went to NYU. This was your thesis project, I believe. And you said some really interesting things about this book, that you thought it's too strange, nobody will read it. You effectively put it in the drawer, like maybe metaphorically, perhaps even literally put it in the old, this is my first novel drawer. And, one thing that you said that really struck me is about audience. And you just said you didn't, you weren't really thinking about an audience when you wrote this, which I think is just like such an interesting thing. I think the way that authors talk about their imagined audience is always revelatory. Mm-hmm. And I just sometimes wonder, like, is it even possible to actually write without an audience in mind? And I would just say, like, when I do my own writing, I used to tell my kids when they were littler than they are, they used to eat up bedtime stories. And I often like think of my little kids when I write, even though I write for adults, I guess because like, it's just that feeling of like, just even that feeling of a human being there, like waiting for the work and like watching me and like, are they entertained or not? So anyway, I'm just fascinated by this idea of like, were you truly writing like not for an audience, or what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it was Jeffrey Eugenides who said that you should write as though it's a letter to your smartest friend. And I think I do, if I have any kind of audience in mind, that's the model that works the best for me. Was it Kurt Vonnegut who said that, like, if you open all the windows of your story to the world, it will get pneumonia? Like, I think for me, I mean, in a workshop setting, you're very explicitly writing for people and people you know. And so when I was developing this in the MFA, I think I workshopped it like maybe twice. And then I was writing with my advisor, and who's Rick Moody. And I think I wrote about 130 pages for the thesis. And the book is now like 330 pages. But so in that sense, I was very much writing for Rick to read it. And I guess he was in my mind. But he's such a voracious reader and such a kind of omnivorous reader that I never felt that kind of pressure that I'd felt with other programs or other professors, that there was a certain aesthetic or there was a certain style or a certain author they wanted me to sound like. I mean, very often, like, that author is the teacher. Like, they just want everything to sound like what they write, and they'll just tell you how they would write it. But Rick wasn't like that at all. So I think after I finished the MFA, I really was kind of on my own. And I think I did have a kind of imagined, I think it was helpful for me to think about one reader who was smarter than I was reading it. And that way I never felt like, I always felt challenged by the reader, and I didn't feel like I had to pander to the reader. I think I do consistently write as though my audience is smarter than I am.
And I mean, I love that Eugenides line. That is great. And do you feel that you just said, like, you like to think of a smarter reader? Like, is it actually a flesh and blood human being that you're thinking of, or is it just a kind of amalgam?
Yeah, no, it's not usually an individual. I mean, sometimes, like in the past, when I've been writing with, as I said, like groups of people, either informally or in a program, obviously there are like certain friends or 2 or 3 writers in that group that you really respect, and maybe subconsciously you're writing for them. But I don't think that works for me. Like, when I'm just writing on my own, I think if I start to think about an individual, a specific individual, it's like I start to, I guess, warp my personality to fit them. I think I'm too much of a people pleaser. I would just contort myself too dramatically to suit someone else. So it has to be, for me, it has to be a kind of vague idea.
So you can't talk about this book without talking about the language in it. And it's just so, I mean, virtuosic is the word that I just keep repeating on this show. I've probably said that word like 6 times already, but it is that. And it's so full of energy. That's how I feel when I read Jennifer Egan, is just like the energy is just humming below the surface. And I guess what I wanted to ask you was, like, how would you define your personal aesthetic sort of on the sentence level? You call it a polyphonic novel, and like in part of what that implies is that there's many voices, and the voices are kind of equal and different, and there isn't a kind of unifying one voice of like the narrator per se. But still, I like, for example, if you could fill in the blank, you don't have to do this, but one way to answer this question would be like, you, Tess Gunty, feel you have really written a great sentence or passage when blank. Like, what is that feel like to you?
I think the combination of something feeling both inevitable and surprising is often what I'm seeking, either in the plot or on a micro level. I learn a lot from contemporary poets. I think I started to become really, really enchanted by contemporary poets a few years before I started this book, like Anne Carson and Claudia Rankine, Maggie Nelson. Those are kind of hybrid genre work writers. But I love Yusef Komunyakaa and Morgan Parker and Chasey K. Smith and Robin Cost-Lewis and so many others. Ocean Vuong, of course. I think, and Sharon Olds, like poetry, I think, especially for some reason, poetry written, I mean, obviously I like older things as well, but I think when you read poetry that's kind of fashioned from the materials of your own world, and you see that it can become this transcendent, you can use language to shape something transcendent from the trash of life. It feels, I think there's nothing more arresting than great language. And that's usually what I feel driven by first. I tend to feel like I'm following the language where it takes me. and I try to write pretty associatively. But I am obsessive about language, I think, on the first draft. Like some people can just kind of write a first draft without thinking about the prose, and then they'll come back and they'll shape the prose. But for me, I wish that worked, but I have to let the language lead me.
Yeah, and when I interviewed Jennifer on the show, she said something similar. And George Saunders, when he was on the show, also said something similar. Just that the way Saunders phrased it is just about how like that the sentence kind of contains the DNA of the organic whole, and it's sort of if that organic unit keeps multiplying itself authentically, you're going to get something surprising and genuine in the end.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I was just reading A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, and he makes this argument for incremental revision in that book that I found really compelling, and it was very much my experience, which is when you revise a little bit every single day, which is usually what I do, you bring every self to the text. You bring the hungry person, you bring the angry person, the person who had that revelatory conversation with a friend, who just listened to that podcast, whatever. And so the sum of those selves is always greater than the 2 or 3 selves that would do like a major pass.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think that's true for me.
So you said a moment ago about your language that when you can, I think, what did you say? It was something like when you can find something transcendent in something sort of mundane, or you might have used the word trashy or something, but like I wanted to kind of pivot into the themes of this work. And that transcendence is, to me, really what's at the heart of this work. I mean, I think you've got a lot of stuck, hung up people who are imprisoned and trapped in their own way. And there's this line, Blandine, the main character, has this line. She has many lines that are sort of like this or mean something similar, but she says, "We're all just sleepwalking. I want to wake up. That is my dream, to wake up." And that just sort of encapsulates, frankly, like what everybody is sort of going through in this work. Is that a fair read?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the copy for, I don't know if it's the UK version or the American version of the novel says, "But Blondine isn't like the other residents of her building." And I sort of resisted it because I thought that's not how I was thinking of her, actually. I was thinking of her as just a slightly more awake version of everyone around her. And sort of, she was like she contained the sort of innermost longings of pretty much every character. And one of them is, I mean, I think the only way that she is maybe a little bit different is that she does want to be awake. Whereas I think for a lot of other people, it's maybe it's just easier to be kind of asleep in one's life if one's life is difficult and painful.
Wow. Yeah. Another read I had on that, Tess, was, we're going to talk about Catholicism in a minute because I sort of like what you're doing with Catholicism here, and we both come from Catholic backgrounds. But one thought that I've had like across many years in my life was that I also am sort of preoccupied with prisons as a metaphor. And I've always wondered to myself if this is a sort of kind of like Augustinian kind of Catholic preoccupation of like the soul trapped in the flesh. And so the prison is just sort of the way a Catholic learns to see themselves, as being trapped in the fleshly prison from a young age. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, we receive such conflicting messages about the body in Catholic education. I think like, on the one hand, you're supposed to view your body as a temple, which I suppose could still be viewed as some kind of imprisonment. But on the other hand, you are so many pleasures of the body are steeped in shame and sort of rules and regulations. And I mean, I think especially for women in the church, like from a young age, you were just sort of raised to police your body very, very heavily and to sort of manage everybody else's reactions to you. And I think that it is a very religious concept. It's a very religious complex, I think, to develop a very troubled, and I think you see this like very dramatically staged in the female mystics that I was reading about. Like they had almost always extremely troubled relationships with their bodies. They were almost always starving themselves and physically punishing themselves on some level, and then claiming that when they reached divine ecstasy, they were sort of out of their bodies and pure bliss. But I think all of that simply speaks to a very unhealthy, troubled, and complex message about the body.
I think so. And so it's a good segue into the next topic, which I blush to say is actually about sex. But I think that like in a lot of the interviews that you've done, I've seen a few of them, and like this just sort of hasn't come up. And maybe I haven't seen all the interviews, but I feel like this is like a strikingly great part of your book. And I think that it fits into this theme of transcendence. And, you know, pretty early on, I started thinking of the Bernini sculpture, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and this kind of like sacred kind of orgasm that sculpture is so known for. And then, you know, you later on bring up Saint Teresa. You don't bring up that sculpture in particular, but you do bring up Saint Teresa. And like, you know, what was like sex scenes can just go so off the rails and be so poorly done so often. But like these sex scenes were like really original and really unique. And frankly, they were meaningful because it often fit into this yearning for some kind of like breakthrough experience, some kind of way to just like resurrect oneself into a life, which is not a rehearsal of a life, but which is actually like the thing itself, as they say. So I just want to say like how impressed I was with those. And I just was curious about your take on those scenes and like how you thought about writing them.
Thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me. Yeah, I don't think anyone's asked me about these yet. I mean, I guess I think of two scenes in the book that are very different. One is in a very problematic relationship, and then the other is in a very healthy marriage. And yet I think the similarities that I think there were similarities in that both are from the women's perspective, and that it is, a rare moment for both of these women where they feel like they can sort of really enjoy corporeality and really enjoy being alive, which is not something that either of them, but it doesn't come naturally to either of them. And one thing I'm really interested in is like in brain scans of people who are meditating or are reaching some kind of, divine ecstasy, whether it's drug induced or it's, from a kind of more religious meditation perspective. One thing that's common among many of these subjects is that the part of the brain that processes the self goes quiet. And a lot of people report, this feeling of blissful unity with everything around them, not just the living creatures, but objects as well. And I find that there are, just a few moments in life where you can glimpse that kind of unity. It also happens, I think, when I'm concentrating really. I think it's documented to happen during like a flow state of intense focus on anything. But another time that it happens for these characters is when they're having good sex. And it's like, I think that these moments where you can kind of earthly portals into something more transcendent or divine really interest me. And then the sex scene, the one in the married couple, it's a young married couple who's been trying to have a baby for a while. And I didn't have that in the first draft. My editor asked me to put that in the book. And I'm really glad he did, because it was, he said like, we were just trying to make a few more touches of light in the book. And so there were a couple other efforts to do that, but he thought maybe we need one scene of like just human tenderness in intimacy, which you don't see that often throughout the rest of the book. So that scene was really hard for me to write because it's so, as you said, it's so easy to do it badly. And I think because I was raised so Catholic, it was like, what words can I say? What words can I not say? But I don't know. I took a lot of, I guess I really love like the sex scenes in Luster by Raven Leilani. I think
Oh
that
yeah.
that's really, really
Terrific.
bold and just like honest and surprising and tender and intimate, but also, yeah, I mean, so I learned a lot from those scenes.
And just like not, frankly, just not negative, not neurotic, not full of manipulation, not full of somebody's like hidden agenda, but that the reader can like devastatingly see. That scene with Hope, like the scene of light that you were just describing, really landed with me. And it landed with me not just because it was well written, like everything in the book, but it landed for that very reason that it stood out. And it didn't stand out just in this book, but it stood out from, frankly, what else is out there? I mean, what a beautiful relationship and beautiful like way that these two people love each other and express that love. I loved it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was funny when I was trying to think about how to write a sex scene because my editor didn't really tell me like exactly what characters or whatever.
Yeah.
But I was like, what would be kind of surprising or different? And I thought, actually, nowadays, what might be most surprising is writing sex between a married couple that's just like fairly vanilla and
Totally.
and still making it like the challenge I gave myself was could I write that and still make it moving?
Yeah.
That was what I was trying to do.
Well, success. All right, let's keep moving because like I want to talk about Catholicism so well, and I'm like leading to this like moment, which I think is going to be so great when I tell you who the true comp is for this book, but it's probably going to be a letdown to everybody, but I'm excited about it. Anyway, Catholic background, all Catholic schools. My dad is a professor at Catholic University. He even taught at Notre Dame, where you went. My brother went there, all this stuff. We have a very similar kind of schooling background. And I think also both of us, from what I can tell from your interviews, are sort of like lapsed Catholics. I mean, I guess you could call it, at least I would call myself kind of like culturally Catholic, I guess. But, what I want to say about Catholicism in this book, which I like so much, is that my experience of Catholicism was very positive, and it was an unusual kind of experience. I mean, my family was sort of like, it took the best of the 60s. It was very sort of like kumbaya and like folk mass and like mass in somebody's living room with a couple guitars and a sing-along. I mean, like, I had priests who were like friends of my parents and like, uncles that like wanted to be priests or went into the priest and then came out to get married. And it's like, the whole thing was very positive and folksy and just very micro level. And it wasn't about big, masses in Latin and incense and all that. And it certainly wasn't about all the scandal in the Catholic Church, which I feel like is so, sort of deservedly so. It is the big story about Catholicism and the dominant narrative. But I'm just like, when I read your book, I was like, oh man, this is like how I used to see Catholicism before all that stuff, like where saints were like really interesting people and noble people and smart people and like sort of culture heroes in a way, right? And I just loved reading about Catholicism in that way.
Thank you. I mean, what you're saying sounds so similar to my experience of Catholicism within my household. Like, my parents were the same way, very, interested in the social justice aspect of Catholic social teaching, and they were quite progressive and always, more interested in the kind of Vatican II revival of the church. And then in my wider community, I think I encountered a much more conservative, rule-based, kind of dead, anti-question Catholicism. And so by the time I went to Notre Dame because my dad worked there, we got free tuition. And luckily at Notre Dame, I think the kind of Catholicism, it's complicated. There's so many different worlds there, but I think there is a really strong presence there of people like that who think in a much more, I suppose, humanistic way and are, interested in this, in social justice above all else. But I was still so sick of the Catholic Church by the time I left. I'd been forced to go to Mass for my whole life. It was like the major conflict of my teenage years was like a theological disagreement about the transubstantiation with my parents. And so I was really surprised to see the Catholicism in the book when it was appearing, not laced with any bitterness, really. It was this Catholicism that I also associated with hope and and sort of mystery and intellectual rigor. And my mom's Catholicism is very supernatural. She's very driven by visions and signs and wonders and miracles. And she has a lot of stories on her side of the family, especially among her sisters. She's one of 12 children. Sort of like stories that I can't really make sense of now. Like I don't believe that anyone's lying, and I don't know how to explain them. The apparitions coming to people, or prophecies, or little miracles, and so I think growing up among those stories, it sort of makes Catholicism feel inseparable from magic and all the other supernatural forces that are so compelling to you when you're a child. And that's kind of I think that sort of Alice in Wonderland space is where I was trying to be within Catholicism in this book.
So I also, when I grew up, because I was around priests a lot, and there would be, my father was a mathematics professor, ultimately at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. But, he was friends with other priests who were professors at kind of Catholic universities all over. And so I would sit down in the summers when they did research together, and I remember just being across the picnic table from them, and they would tell me stories of miracles that they had witnessed. And these are people who are super smart, professors at universities, totally loving people who have helped my family and are sort of almost family. And they're telling me about these miracles. And I sort of feel the same way as you. I loved what you just said a minute ago, which is sort of nobody's lying, but I don't know what to make of it. And I think that Catholicism has just been through it so much that it's sort of impossible. Like people are just on the outside and they're it's all terrible, it's all bunk. And people don't have the experience that you and I have, where you have wonderful people, loving people, smart people, also telling you these stories. And I just felt that energy come through in this book.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of reminds me of what I was just thinking about with the sort of the most radical thing was to just write a sex scene between a young married couple. I think in a way it was also the most surprising decision was to write Catholicism nowadays without making the abuse scandals at the forefront of the narrative, without making the oppression at the forefront of the narrative. And, for a lot of people, these kinds of mystical or miraculous experiences happen across cultures, across religions, across time. And I think the human brain is capable of pretty incredible things. And there's also, even on a subatomic level, everything is a lot stranger than it seems. So I'm not really interested in dismissing anyone's experiences outright, especially of kind of supernatural experiences of any kind.
Right. So final piece on Catholicism, which is I want to talk about who this work made me think of. And so just to recap, people are loving in every review, and the reviews are just all positive. And I haven't found a single negative review. And everybody's oh, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. And, you hear about Rachel Kushner and Dennis Johnson, David Foster Wallace, Jennifer Egan. I thought an interesting comp was Paul Thomas Anderson, a kind of ensemble film like Magnolia. All these things are great. But, the person I was thinking of is another Midwestern Catholic who wrote in many different voices and whose Catholic obsessions crashed kind of famously against the kind of modern, chaotic, nihilistic world that we live in. And that writer is T.S. Eliot. And I just, it's crazy because I had this thing, I was all psyched about this, right? And then you brought up T.S. Eliot in the book, and I'm damn it. So she knows too, and it's not unconscious. I thought this was going to be revelatory, but no, clearly he was an obvious influence for, somebody you were thinking about at least while writing some of this book. But I just, I think it's such an interesting comp, and I can't wait to hear your take on it. But I think it's such an interesting comp because, that's sort of what The Wasteland on one level is about. It's all these different voices shot through with genuine, authentic religious longing, profound religious longing. but sort of only finding like this scraps, heaps, and trash of like modern life to crash up against. And that's just so much of what I saw in this work too.
Wow. Well, thank you for that comp. I mean, there was definitely, I think I read The Wasteland for the first time when I was 19, and then I reread it, I mean, multiple times every year. And there was a time when I was writing this novel, I think I went through a phase where I would reread it at the beginning of every writing session. And then I actually had copied the poem and put it on my wall in my bedroom. And I mean, that poem it means a lot to me because it's so the portal into poetry. Like, it was the first poem that I read probably in my whole life that I felt this kind of visceral, intense connection to. I didn't know that it could be so driven by narrative either. And I think T.S. Eliot has an essay on Dante in which he says something about how good poetry will sort of evoke a reaction in your body before your mind can make sense of it. And he doesn't phrase it like that, but that's kind of what I take from it. And I think that's true. That's so true for me of T.S. Eliot. I think much of his poetry, and he was a really like problematic man, but I think the Wasteland is definitely one of my most significant influences.
There's this line I want to read to you from your work. It's just a couple sentences. Blandine shuts herself inside her room and thinks and thinks and thinks herself into all kinds of doom. And by sundown, she's afraid of the doorknob. That is so T.S. Eliot to me, right? It's like this kind of broken poem. It's like it rhymes and it has rhythm, but then like, and that last line about the doorknob is so like intentionally kind of prosaic and at odds with the rhythm and the rhyme of the previous lines. It's like, that is just T.S. Eliot. The spirit was living in that. The spirit of T.S. Eliot is alive in those lines, you know?
Wow, that's a real honor.
Well, anyway, I loved it. I'm glad you sort of saw it, and it's so cool to see you say that like The Wasteland was such an influence because again, I found that sort of singing in this work behind the scenes. All right, we're gonna do one more question from me, and then we'll have a couple audience questions before we wrap. You know, the one thing that people really talk about with this work, kind of right off the top, which I'm saving towards the end for some strange reason, is the idea that it's this polyphonic novel. You know, and you have an apartment building called the Rabbit Hutch. Sorry, I've just been like so interested in the ideas of your book. I didn't get around to like all the great stories and characters in it. I'm like, this book, it just like lit me up intellectually. So I wanted to kind of start there. But anyway, there is a bunch of great storytelling in this work, and it's a polyphonic novel. It's about an apartment building called the Rabbit Hutch, and you see kind of all the different characters kind of on their own little journeys, and then eventually they intermingle in each other's lives, and there is a story that kind of unites them all. But I must admit, I hadn't heard the term polyphonic novel, so I looked it up, and I just wanted to hear you kind of talk about it. And so, this is my definition now, just kind of boiling it down. A polyphonic novel has many voices that can't be gathered into one system. Whereas I guess the opposite of it is a monologic novel, in which like even if there's different characters and even different voices, there is a unifying truth. There's a kind of theory of reality that sort of unites everything. But in polyphonic novels, there isn't one system that can like truly unite these disparate voices. And I guess my question to you is like, I first want to know, like, is that right? Like, do you agree with that? And then, is that the right definition? And then second, the question is just, why was that the form that you needed to tell this story?
Well, I actually haven't heard the second term that you used. What is that? What is the term that you used?
It's called monologic. This is straight from Wikipedia.
Right?
Like so.
I mean, I love that, and I feel so bad that I haven't learned more about this yet. I'd have to think really hard about. It's kind of impossible for me to think of a novel where the multiple voices cannot be united under one system or ideas. I mean, maybe they give examples, but it's very hard to think of, because I mean, we're just we're such associative thinkers, and so I think whenever you're writing, even if you think you're writing without a plan or without a through line, you almost always discover one.
Yes, totally.
And it's kind of like, I was just talking to someone the other day who was referencing the work of a psychoanalyst, and the psychoanalyst, I don't remember who it was, but he wrote that she wrote that digression is secular revelation. And I think the idea is kind of when you're in psychoanalysis, the point is to become more legible to yourself. And so if you go in and you know the story you're going to tell the person, you're not going to learn a lot about yourself. But if you're allowed to sort of tell the story in such a way that, I'm kind of distracted by this other glittery idea over here, and I'm going to go over there and I don't know why, and we're going to talk about that for a long time. And really, I thought this was about my boss, but it's actually about my mother or something,
Right.
But like, I think when I'm writing, multiple voices allow me that kind of digression. And I guess what I mean is multiple voices allow me to sort of inhabit the chaotic, or maybe represent something about the chaotic nature of existing within one body and mind and oneself. And to stage it, I guess, a little more explicitly in other people. But in this book, there were a couple voices that don't really have anything to do with the main action of the narrative. And even one of the main characters, Joan, she's almost not at all affected by what happens in the book. And yet I think of her as having the almost most traditional character arc from beginning, middle to end. And she's profoundly affected by what happens, even though she has no participation in the events. So when I was trying to make a portrait of a place, inviting many voices to the table, especially voices of different physical concerns, there are older residents, there are younger residents, people, men, women, there's a very rich and entitled character. And then most of them are really struggling financially. And then there's this interloper too, who sends an email essentially to one of the characters, and we get his story for a while. And I think this allowed
which was great. I don't want to digress, but that was maybe my favorite part of the book. But anyway, leave that for the reader to discover. That was amazing.
Yeah, so I think many voices, whether or not they're all part of one system or not, allowed me to create a more balanced composition of this place.
And so, okay, we're going to go to audience questions in 1 second. And I know I'm putting you on the spot with this, but I mean, it just sort of begs the question. I mean, you made this tantalizing comment where you said, well, it's almost impossible to write this so-called monologic book, a word that is new to both of us today. But, unconsciously, inevitably, there will be a unifying something standing behind the work. And so I guess my question to you then is, could you even articulate what that is for this book?
I think entrapment and freedom were two poles that I was consistently drawn to in this book. And then predators and prey. And I think one thing that was important to me was that each of those binaries was sort of, there's a term that my undergraduate advisor from Notre Dame, Joelle McSweeney, used in an interview I conducted with her recently. She said she's drawn to things that are double but not binary, and she's drawn to indivisible opposites. And I think that those things are true for both of those terms I just introduced. Like entrapment and freedom are double but not binary, and they are indivisible opposites. They're so woven together that it's impossible to define one without the other. And same with, I think, predators and prey. I think anytime there was a so-called predator in this book, I tried to also show instances in which they were prey. So those are things that I think were obsessions throughout.
Yeah. Oh, the entrapment thing was clear. I saw that. Now I'm going back through all the stories, predator, prey, and now it's shining a new light on everything. Okay, can't get distracted, have to focus. But that's really interesting. Okay, let's take a couple questions from the audience before we wrap. Just throw them up on screen. Okay, Bozina, thank you for this wonderful question. Do the American and British versions differ, and how?
They don't differ in content, just cover and some spelling. But I learned this when I didn't know this before, but when you sell a book, sometimes international rights will happen at the same time. Sometimes they'll happen later. Sometimes it just depends a lot on your situation. But when I sold this book, a few different publishing houses from outside of America bought it. But the only editor that collaborates with the American editor is the British editor. And that's possibly just because of language, but maybe audience, I don't know. So my British editor read it, and Juliet Maybe of One World, she then sent her comments to my editor, and then he was free to sort of take what he thought was right from that. And then he sent me all the comments consolidated. Mm-hmm. So they kind of collaborated on the editing.
Got it. But fundamentally, same book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's do one more question, if we have one. Yep. Okay. Are the voices differentiated within the Rabbit Hutch? And if so, was it a linguistic challenge to create different voices? And which was your favorite?
So most of the book is written in third person omniscient, or close third person. So it will, drop into different characters' lives. But there are a few sections written in first person. And actually, I think all of those are voices that are really different from mine. So there's one recurring section from a boy called Jack. He is the roommate of the main character. And he has a very different, I guess it was kind of easier for me to write his sections because they were so different from my own voice and my own concerns. He's, I guess I was thinking about, have you read any, what is his name? Reese DJ Pancake. He wrote these really extraordinary short stories, and Jack's voice isn't really like the short stories, but I was thinking of them. He committed suicide when he's in his early 20s. So he only wrote one book, but there's just a collected stories of him out there, and it is sublime. So I guess I was kind of thinking about him. I was kind of thinking about J.D. Salinger and sort of The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Gennades. Those things all kind of came together in Jack's voice. And then there's another first person narrative, which is what we just referenced, which is like a long kind of standalone chapter that's written via email to another character. And then, and that's also from a middle-aged man's perspective with a very different voice and a very different set of concerns from my own. And then there's some internet comments throughout that have I was trying to kind of replicate funny online dialect developed. But yeah, I mean, I love writing the internet sections just because I think the internet is the way that people choose to present on the internet is so funny to me all the time. And so also surprisingly moving. And I don't know, it's just a place where I constantly am surprised by what I find, but I also think the best and worst of humanity is revealed there. So it was very fun to try to replicate it.
Yeah. So going back to what I previously revealed was maybe my favorite part of the book, the email, the clue game section, which you just referenced. Would you ever write a thriller? Because that was I was like, what? What's going to happen? What is happening? It was like this little mini thriller novel in 12 pages. It was so good. Was that just fun for you and you'd never do a full book?
I wrote that chapter. I remember I had a deadline the next day I had to turn something into my advisor. And I was really disappointed with how little I'd done on the book since I'd last met with him. So I sat down and wrote that chapter pretty much in one sitting through the night. I started at midnight and I ended at 7 a.m. And I was so freaked out by the end of it. I was looking behind me and of course I edited it a lot, but I think it just poured out. I don't know. But I think I would love to. I think my ideal book, I have such a weakness for really, really well-constructed mysteries. And I think I don't really have a puzzle brain. I don't have a brain that's very good at puzzles. It takes me a very, very long time to do it. So maybe that's my, if I could have another talent, if I could develop a writerly talent, it would be developing mystery plots.
Oh my God. Do it. It's going to work. I'm telling you. All right, let's do one more super, super quick one, and then we'll wrap. Just one more question from the audience. Okay. What is one story Tess especially remembers from her mother's superstitions? Wow. if you're willing?
Ooh, let me think. I mean, so she's not actually a very superstitious person, but she does have. Okay, one story that I remember is actually about her sister and her mother. So her sister Susie died of ovarian cancer when she was in her 40s, and she and my grandmother had a very fraught relationship because, as I think I mentioned, my mom was one of 12 children, and I think her mother was very burdened by this many children. She didn't want to have that many children. It was like because of the Catholic ban on birth control. She had asked for birth control, permission to use it, just condoms from her priest, and he wouldn't let her. And so she had 6 more kids. And she was, I think, fairly just overwhelmed and depressed. And so I think she felt that she was very harsh on her first daughters, especially, the oldest ones. And Susie was one of those. And so my grandmother was driving to Susie's house to, Susie was really sick, but she was still alive, to sort of apologize. She had worked herself up to say that she was sorry. And yet when she arrived, Susie had just died. And so she didn't get to say that she was sorry. And when she and my granddad were walking back to their car, the windows were all rolled up. It was parked in the driveway. She opened her door and found a rose petal on her seat. And rose gardening was the one thing that she and Susie had in common. And it was like super fragrant, and it was impossible for it to have gotten in the car because, as I said, the windows were rolled up. There were no flowers in the car. So I remember hearing this story when I was a child. And then years later, I was in California, which is where my grandparents lived, and I was visiting them. And people were passing around like a ring box of something. And it got to me, and I opened it, and this fragrance of a rose petal, it was almost like more than a whole bouquet of roses. It was the most intense fragrance I've ever smelled from any flower, and it was just one petal in this ring box, which, what to make of that, I don't know.
I got like all kinds of crazy chills when you told that story. Wow. Thank you for telling that.
Yeah.
That it's just beautiful. And I'm just going to let that sink in.
Yeah.
Tess, this has been amazing. I have one more question for you, but I just want to make sure before we get off air that people look at this beautiful cover. Like, I would frame this cover. It's so cool looking. I'd put it in my living room. It's an awesome cover. Folks, the book is The Rabbit Hutch. Please buy it. It's amazing. You're catching a wonderful new talent on the come up. Tess, the last question I want to ask, I asked to all the authors who come on my show, is just imagine, we were talking earlier about the ideal reader and kind of who you see as the audience. But just imagine whoever the smart person is, just imagine this ideal reader, and imagine that person has gotten to the end of this book. And just, if you could, just try to describe in a phrase or even just a single word, what is the feeling that this reader has when they finish reading The Rabbit Hutch?
I hope it registers as a lived experience rather than a read experience. That's really all I hope. I hope that someone has an immersive experience with this book that is entirely theirs and that no one else could have. I feel like the interaction between a reader's imagination and a writer's imagination is this kind of sacred chemistry, and it's never the same between two readers. So yeah, I would hope that it simply felt lived.
That's terrific. That is terrific. And I've never heard somebody give that answer before. So that is really cool. Tess, this has been a complete and utter delight. The entire thing, reading the book and then talking to you, it's just been awesome. This is like why I do this, to have conversations like this. So congratulations on all your success. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Awesome. All right, folks. So I will be back next week with a new mystery author. Please tune in a week from today and check it out. Thanks, everybody, for watching.